In the pitch-black night, the constant fluorescent buzz of the 24-hour laundromat stood out as the only beacon of life in the otherwise silent town of Bridgeton. Yet, beneath its unremarkable exterior, a mystery was slowly unraveling under the cloak of darkness. Sheriff Tom Hollis, a man haunted by a personal tragedy, found himself disturbed by the recurring sight of a young black girl alone at the laundromat, night after night. As he delved deeper into this enigma, little did he know that his investigation would uncover a heart-wrenching revelation that would irrevocably alter both their lives. What secret was this young child concealing? How could the struggles of one small girl become the key to mending a shattered man's heart? Before we dive deeper into this poignant journey, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from today. If you find this video engaging, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The small town of Bridgeton lay quietly under a canopy of stars, its streets deserted except for the occasional stray cat or the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. While most of its inhabitants were deep in slumber, with windows shut and curtains drawn, for Sheriff Tom Hollis, the night was just beginning. Stationed at the edge of Main Street in his patrol car, Tom clasped his lukewarm coffee with weathered hands. At 53, his years were like a well-worn coat, comfortable yet showing signs of wear. His neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair and his weary yet vigilant blue eyes scanned the silent town. For the past 5 years, Tom had chosen the night shift, a period his colleagues gladly ceded to him. They had families and lives that thrived in the daylight, but for Tom, the night was a sanctuary, a refuge from the memories that plagued him by day. As he sipped his bitter coffee, Tom's eyes briefly met the small photo on his dashboard, a smiling woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails. Sarah and Emily, his wife and daughter, lost to him forever in a tragic accident 7 years prior. Quickly looking away, Tom focused on the quiet street ahead, preferring the solitude of his patrol car, which allowed him to evade deeper connections and daylight that brought too much pain. Bridgeton was a quaint town, more of a dot on the map, with a low crime rate and peaceful nights. Tom's duties were simple: patrol the streets, check on the few businesses open late, and occasionally disperse a group of rowdy teenagers. The predictability suited him, demanding nothing more than his presence. As the clock ticked past 11:30 p.m., Tom started his engine and commenced his usual circuit. He drove slowly down Main Street, past the darkened shop fronts. The only signs of activity were from the 24-hour diner and, a few blocks down, the laundromat. It was there that Tom's attention was drawn to a slight figure moving toward the entrance. Squinting to see better, he was surprised to find a young girl, no older than 8 or 9, black, with her hair neatly braided and wearing an oversized faded blue jacket. She clutched a small, overstuffed bag of clothes. Instinctively concerned, Tom wondered what a child was doing out so late by herself, particularly at a laundromat. He watched as she entered the building, the door closing behind her. Although he considered checking on her, he initially dismissed the urge, rationalizing that she must be accompanied by a parent who was simply out of sight. Nevertheless, as he drove away, a nagging feeling of unease remained. Something about the lone girl in the darkness touched a nerve he preferred to ignore. Over the next several nights, the same scenario played out. Tom made his rounds, and each time he passed by, he saw the girl, always alone, always at the same time, always with her bag of clothes. His curiosity deepened, and he began to adjust his route to pass by the laundromat more frequently. Her routine was unchanging: enter just before midnight, spend hours inside, methodically handling the laundry. It wasn't until the 5th night that Tom acknowledged something was amiss. He parked across the street and observed as the girl approached the laundromat. This time, he noticed the loose fit of her clothes, her cautious walk, and the nervous glances she threw around before entering. A tightness formed in Tom's chest. This was no mere chore. Something else was at play here. As he sat wrestling with his thoughts, Tom became aware of hushed voices nearby. 2 women walked past his car, deeply engaged in a conversation. As they moved by, Tom caught fragments of their exchange. "That little girl again, every night like clockwork. It's not right for a child to be out at this hour. Someone should call social services, shouldn't they?" Their voices faded into the distance, but their words echoed in Tom's mind. He wasn't the only one who had noticed. The town was starting to talk, and people were growing concerned. Rightfully so, Tom thought. A child alone at night was always cause for concern, but something restrained Tom from immediate action. Perhaps it was the memory of his own daughter, reminding him how hasty judgments could sometimes cause more harm than good. Or perhaps it was the silent resilience he observed in the little girl, who carried herself with a determination that seemed beyond her years. Whatever the reason, Tom knew he couldn't just barge in and start interrogating. He needed to understand the full situation before taking any action. However, he also knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. There was clearly something amiss with this child, and as the sheriff, it was his duty to find out what. As he started his car and pulled away from the curb, Tom resolved to keep a closer eye on the situation, gather more information, and then decide on the best course of action. He owed it to the girl, and to his own conscience, to handle this correctly. Little did Tom know, his decision to delve deeper would set him on a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his town. The mystery of the little girl at the laundromat was just beginning, and it would require all of Tom's skills as a sheriff and as a human being to unravel it. The following night, Tom timed his arrival at the laundromat to coincide with the girl's usual appearance. As he parked his car, he saw her small figure approaching from around the corner. He watched as she entered the laundromat, then took a deep breath. He had spent the day contemplating how to handle the situation and had decided that a direct approach was best. After all, he was the sheriff. It was his responsibility to ensure the safety of everyone in the town, especially children. Stepping out of his car, Tom straightened his uniform and adjusted his hat, aiming to appear official yet non-threatening. The last thing he wanted was to frighten the girl. As he entered the laundromat, the bell above the door chimed softly. The place was nearly empty except for an older man dozing in a corner and the little girl, busy loading clothes into a washing machine. Tom approached her and noticed the frayed edges of her jacket and the scuff marks on her shoes. She seemed even smaller up close, her movements careful and deliberate as she measured out detergent. "Hello there," Tom said, keeping his voice gentle. The girl froze, then slowly turned to face him. Her large, dark eyes met his briefly before darting away. She stood silently, her small hands clutching a T-shirt. Tom crouched to her eye level. "I'm Sheriff Hollis," he said, tapping the badge on his chest. "What's your name?" The girl looked at his badge, then back at his face. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she took a small step back, putting the washing machine between them. Tom's heart ached at her evident fear. He was about to speak again when the bell chimed. Both he and the girl looked up to see a black woman enter, carrying a large basket of laundry. "Hey, Immani," the woman called out as she made her way to an empty machine. The girl, Immani, gave a shy wave and a quiet hi in response. Tom stood up, relief washing over him. This must be Immani's mother, he thought. Perhaps there was a simple explanation for all this. The woman nodded politely to Tom as she passed, then began loading her laundry. Tom watched as Immani quickly moved to another machine in the corner, keeping her head down and focusing intently on her task. Tom hesitated, unsure how to proceed. His instincts still told him something was off, but he didn't want to make assumptions. Perhaps Immani was just shy around strangers, or maybe her mother trusted her to do the laundry alone sometimes. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm. Deciding it was best not to push the issue further at the moment, Tom gave one last look around the laundromat. Immani was now sitting on a bench, legs swinging as she watched the washing machine spin. The woman who had greeted her was absorbed in a magazine she'd pulled from her purse. With a small sigh, Tom made his way back to the door. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. What more could he do? He had no concrete evidence that anything was wrong, just a persistent nagging feeling in his gut. As Tom climbed back into his patrol car, his eyes were drawn to the photo on his dashboard. Emily's smiling face looked back at him, and for a moment he saw Immani's face superimposed over his daughter's. Both little girls, both vulnerable in their own ways. Tom started the engine, his mind racing. He had hoped this visit would alleviate his concerns, but instead it had only deepened them. As he pulled away from the curb, he made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the laundromat in the coming nights. Something told him this mystery was far from solved. But what if Immani truly needed help, and he, the town sheriff, had neglected his duty to provide it? Tom closed his eyes, attempting to calm his racing heart. He pondered over Immani's shy demeanor, her recoiling from him. Was this mere shyness, or could it indicate something more sinister? And the woman who had greeted Immani. Yes, she had acknowledged her, but was there genuine warmth, any real indication that she was truly responsible for the child? The more Tom considered these points, the more he recognized his limited knowledge based on a fleeting interaction. He questioned himself. What kind of sheriff was he if he couldn't thoroughly investigate a potential case of child endangerment? Opening his eyes, Tom looked out at the deserted street before him. He couldn't simply let this matter slide. He needed certainty about Immani's safety. If he was wrong and everything turned out fine, at least he would have peace of mind. But if he was right, if Immani was indeed in distress, he couldn't forgive himself if he failed to do all he could to aid her. Resolved, Tom shifted his car into drive and headed towards the police station to commence thorough investigations. The next morning found Tom at his desk, surrounded by papers and a computer screen alight with numerous open tabs. He had spent most of the night sifting through records, searching for any trace of Immani or her family. Yet as dawn cast long shadows across his cluttered desk, Tom had to accept he'd come up empty. There was no record of an Immani fitting her description in the local school system, nor an address listed under her name. It seemed as though the girl didn't exist on paper. Frustration gnawed at Tom as he rubbed his weary eyes. How could a child vanish so completely off the grid in a town as small as Bridgeton, where everyone was presumed to know everyone else? Undeterred, Tom resolved to take a different approach. If official records yielded no answers, perhaps the townspeople would. Over the next few days, he spoke with residents, particularly those near the laundromat or those who frequented it. The responses varied. Some had seen Immani and were concerned about a young child out so late, while others hadn't paid much attention, assuming she was with family. Yet, no one knew who she was or where she came from. One conversation stood out to Tom. It was with Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the laundromat. She had seen Immani one night, looking exhausted. Poor little thing looked so tired, Mrs. Johnson had remarked with a crease of worry on her face. I offered her a cookie, but she just shook her head and went back to folding her clothes. It's not right, Sheriff. A child that age should be home in bed, not doing laundry at midnight. Tom agreed wholeheartedly. With each passing day, his concern for Immani grew. He found himself driving by the laundromat increasingly often, hoping to ensure she was all right. Yet, Immani remained a mystery, appearing each night to methodically manage her laundry and then vanishing into the darkness, never seen arriving or leaving. It was as if she materialized from thin air, existing solely within the confines of the laundromat. As days turned into weeks, Tom felt a deepening sense of responsibility towards Immani. Perhaps it was the memory of his daughter, or simply his instinct as a protector, but he knew he couldn't disregard this case. The mystery of Immani had evolved from merely a case to solve. It had become a mission, a purpose that filled the voids in Tom's life. For the first time in years, he was genuinely invested in something beyond his nightly patrols. Yet, this newfound purpose came with a weighty responsibility. Tom understood that if Immani was truly in peril, every day he delayed could put her at greater risk. This thought haunted his sleep, stirring him on restless nights. One such night found him parked across from the laundromat again, long past midnight. Watching Immani's small figure diligently folding clothes reminded him painfully of Emily, his daughter, who had always been keen to help with chores. This memory, usually a source of pain, now instilled a bittersweet warmth. In that moment, watching Immani through the laundromat window, Tom resolved he could no longer remain passive. Whatever the reality of this child's situation, he was determined to uncover it. He owed it to Immani, to his conscience, and to the cherished memory of his family. With a deep breath, Tom stepped out of his car and walked towards the laundromat, unsure of his next steps but certain he had to act. But he knew he had to try. He had to reach out to Immani to offer her whatever assistance he could. As Tom grasped the door handle of the laundromat, he silently vowed to himself and to Immani that he wouldn't stop until he unearthed the truth. Little did he know, this truth would shake him to his very core and transform both their lives forever. The familiar chime of the laundromat door echoed as Tom stepped inside, where the fluorescent lights cast a stark glow over rows of washing machines and dryers. Immani was in her usual corner, meticulously folding a faded T-shirt. Tom approached gently, cautious not to startle her. "Hello, Immani," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. Immani's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and a trace of fear. She stepped back slightly, clutching the shirt to her chest as if it were a shield. "It's okay," Tom reassured, crouching to her level. "I'm not here to bother you. I just want to make sure you're all right." Immani remained silent, watching Tom warily, her body tensed as though she might flee at any moment. Tom's heart ached seeing how guarded she was. What had she experienced to make her so wary? He was about to speak again when he noticed Immani's backpack on the bench behind her, slightly open. Inside, he glimpsed not only clothes but a small blanket and a worn stuffed animal. Before he could process this or decide how to proceed, Immani sprang into action. In one swift movement, she grabbed her backpack, stuffed the folded clothes inside, and darted past Tom towards the door. "Immani, wait!" Tom called out, but it was too late. The door swung shut behind her, its chime ringing in the now empty laundromat. Tom rushed outside, scanning the dark street. He caught sight of Immani's small figure disappearing around the corner of the laundromat. Without hesitation, he pursued her. The chase led him through the silent streets of Bridgeton. Tom's heart pounded as he tried to keep Immani in sight. She was surprisingly quick, weaving between parked cars and darting through alleys. As they neared the outskirts of town, Tom realized they were headed toward the old cemetery. The iron gate loomed ahead, ominously open. Immani slipped through a gap in the cemetery fence and vanished into the shadows cast by the headstones. Tom paused momentarily at the fence. The cemetery at night was a labyrinth of darkness and hidden obstacles. If he wasn't careful, he could easily lose track of Immani or injure himself. However, the thought of leaving Immani alone in such a place propelled him forward. Taking a deep breath, Tom squeezed through the gap and entered the cemetery. Darkness enveloped him as he navigated between the graves. The moon, partially obscured by clouds, provided only faint, shifting light. Tom strained his senses, searching for any sign of Immani. "Immani!" he called out, his voice echoing eerily in the night's stillness. "Immani, please, I just want to help you." But there was no answer. Tom moved deeper into the cemetery, his foot catching on unseen roots and his uniform snagging on low-hanging branches. With each step, his panic grew. Where could she have gone? How could such a small child simply disappear? After what felt like hours, Tom had searched behind every large headstone and peered into every shadowy corner, but Immani was nowhere to be found. It was as if the night had swallowed her whole. Finally, exhausted and disheartened, Tom admitted defeat. He made his way back to the cemetery entrance, his mind swirling with the worst-case scenarios. What if Immani was injured? What if someone else had found her before he could? As he squeezed back through the gap in the fence, a wave of failure washed over Tom. He had been so close to helping her, and now she was lost in the night, possibly in greater danger than before. Tom trudged back to his patrol car, shoulders slumped under the weight of his failure. But as he slid behind the wheel, he made a silent vow. This wasn't over. He would find Immani, no matter what it took. He wouldn't rest until he knew she was safe. With one last look at the dark silhouette of the cemetery, Tom started his car and drove back into town. Tomorrow, he decided, he would redouble his efforts. He would leave no stone unturned in his search for Immani. Little did Tom know, the answers he sought were closer than he realized, and the truth would be more heart-wrenching than he could have ever imagined. The next evening found Tom back at the laundromat, his eyes fixed on the entrance, determined not to miss Immani if she appeared. The events of the previous night had left him shaken, filled with a mix of worry and determination. As the hours ticked by, Tom's anxiety grew. What if Immani didn't come? What if his actions the previous night had scared her away for good? The thought twisted his stomach with guilt. But just as he was about to lose hope, a small figure appeared around the corner. Tom's heart leapt as he recognized Immani, her familiar backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked around cautiously before slipping into the laundromat. Tom waited, watching through the windows as Immani went about her usual routine. She seemed more subdued than usual, her movements slower, more hesitant. Tom's heart ached at the sight. He wanted nothing more than to go in there, to tell her everything would be okay, but he knew he needed to be careful not to scare her off again. So he waited hour after hour, until the laundromat slowly emptied of its other patrons. By the time midnight rolled around, Immani was the only one left inside. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Tom finally stepped out of his car and approached the laundromat. He opened the door slowly, the familiar chime announcing his presence. Immani's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. But before she could flee, Tom held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, Immani," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you or take you away. I just want to talk. Is that all right?" Immani hesitated, her body tense, ready to bolt. But after a long moment, she gave a tiny nod. Tom exhaled, relieved, and slowly made his way over to where Immani stood. As he drew closer, he noticed something that clenched his heart. Immani's eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, as if she had been crying. "Immani," Tom said gently, crouching down to her level, "I'm worried about you. Can you tell me why you're here all alone every night?" Immani's lower lip trembled, but she remained silent. Tom was about to speak again when he noticed Immani's eyelids drooping, her small body swaying slightly where she stood. She looked utterly exhausted, and then, before Tom's eyes, Immani's legs seemed to buckle, and she slumped onto the nearby bench, her eyes fluttering closed despite her attempts to stay awake. Tom watched in stunned silence as Immani curled up on the bench, using her backpack as a makeshift pillow. Within moments, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. The sight struck Tom like a physical blow. This wasn't just a child doing laundry late at night. This was a child with nowhere else to go, a child who had turned the laundromat into a makeshift haven, a warm place to sleep. Tears welled up in Tom's eyes as the full reality of Immani's situation dawned on him. How long had she been living this way? How had he not noticed sooner? As he watched Immani sleep, memories of his own daughter flooded his mind. He thought of Emily, how small and vulnerable she looked when she slept, how he and Sarah had tucked her in, kissed her good night, and ensured she felt safe and loved. And here was Immani, another little girl, sleeping on a hard bench in a laundromat because she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in years, Sheriff Tom Hollis broke down and cried. Silent tears streamed down his face as he sat on the floor next to the bench, keeping watch over Immani as she slept. In that moment, Tom made a silent vow. He would help this child, no matter what it took. He would ensure she never had to spend another night alone in a laundromat. He would provide her the safety and security that every child deserved. As the night wore on, Tom remained at his post, his heart heavy with the weight of his realization, but also filled with a new sense of purpose. He didn't know how yet, but he was determined to make things right for Immani. It was the least he could do for her, and in memory of his own family. Little did Tom know, this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek through the laundromat windows when Immani stirred. Tom, who had dozed off sitting on the floor, snapped awake immediately. He watched as Immani's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding her features as she took in her surroundings. When her gaze landed on Tom, her eyes widened in fear. She sat up quickly, clutching her backpack to her chest. "It's okay, Immani," Tom said softly, his voice hoarse from the long night. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." Immani didn't respond, but didn't attempt to run either. She just sat there, watching Tom warily, her small body tense and ready to flee at any moment. Tom took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next could make all the difference. "Immani," he began gently, "I know you're scared, and I understand why. But I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm here to help you." Immani's grip on her backpack loosened slightly, but she remained silent. "Can you tell me why you've been sleeping here?" Tom asked, keeping his voice low and calm. At the mention of her parents, Immani's lower lip trembled. For a moment, Tom thought she might start crying, but then, in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it, she spoke. "Gone," she whispered. "She got sick, really sick, and then she didn't wake up." Tom felt his heart break all over again. "Oh, Immani," he breathed, "I'm so sorry. What about your dad or other family?" Immani shook her head. "Just me and Mom. We came here for a better life." Her voice trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. Tom had to fight back his own tears as he listened. The pieces were starting to fall into place, painting a picture of unimaginable loss and struggle. "How long have you been on your own?" he asked gently. Immani shrugged. "Don't know. A long time." Tom nodded, his mind racing. How had this child managed to survive on her own for so long? And how had everyone, including himself, failed to notice? "Immani," he said, leaning in slightly, "what you've been through is more than any child should ever have to face. But I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. I'm here to help you. Will you let me?" Immani looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you want to help me?" The question caught Tom off guard for a moment. He wasn't sure how to answer, but then, looking into Immani's eyes, he knew he had to be honest. "Because," he said softly, "a long time ago, I had a little girl too. Her name was Emily, and if she were in trouble, I'd want someone to help her, just like I want to help you. Something in Immani's expression shifted at his words. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a glimmer of hope, so faint it was barely visible, but it was there. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Tom reached out slowly, giving Immani plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Well," he said, "first, we're going to get you some breakfast, and then we're going to go to the police station and figure out how to make sure you're safe and taken care of. How does that sound?" Immani hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a small step, but an important one. "Okay," he echoed, offering Immani a warm smile. "Let's get going, then." As they stood up, Immani clutching her backpack and Tom leading the way, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that. There would be questions to answer, paperwork to fill out, decisions to be made. But for now, in this moment, he had done what he'd set out to do. He had reached Immani and gotten her to trust him enough to accept his help. It was a beginning, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The drive to the police station was quiet, with Immani sitting in the back seat of Tom's patrol car, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Tom kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, still hardly believing the turn of events that had brought them to this point. As they pulled into the station parking lot, Tom could see Immani's body tense up again. "It's okay," he reassured her as he parked the car. "We're just going to talk and figure out how to help you. Nothing bad is going to happen. I promise." Immani gave a small nod, but her eyes were filled with apprehension as they entered the building. The station was quiet at this early hour, with only a few officers beginning their morning shifts. Tom led Immani to his office, closing the door behind them to offer some privacy. "Have a seat," Tom said gently, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Immani perched on the edge of the seat, still clutching her backpack protectively in front of her. Tom sat down, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. He needed to gather more information from Immani, but was cautious not to overwhelm her. "Immani," he began softly, "can you tell me a little more about what happened to your mom? When did she get sick?" Immani's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. "It was a long time ago," she said quietly. "We came here from Haiti. Mom said we'd have a better life, but then she started coughing a lot. She couldn't work anymore." Tom nodded encouragingly, his heart sinking with each word. "And what happened after that?" Tom prompted. "We lost our apartment," Immani continued, her voice barely a whisper. "We stayed in shelters for a while, but then Mom got really bad. They took her to the hospital. She never came back." Tom felt a lump in his throat. "I'm so sorry, Immani. That must have been so hard for you. What did you do after that?" Immani shrugged her small shoulders, her expression somber. "I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice small and hesitant. "Mom always said people might send us back if they found out. I was scared." She paused, her brow furrowing as she searched for the right words. "So I just stayed away, found places to sleep. The laundry place was warm at night." Tom listened intently, his heart aching at the childlike simplicity with which Immani described her ordeal. Despite her limited vocabulary and halting speech, he could clearly perceive the fear, loneliness, and desperation behind her words. The image of this small child, alone and frightened, navigating the streets and seeking warmth in a laundromat was painfully vivid. "You were very brave," Tom said gently, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But you don't have to be alone anymore, Immani. We're here to help you now." Immani looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. "Promise," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I promise," he affirmed strongly. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted them. Tom called for them to enter, and a woman in a smart suit walked in. "Sheriff Hollis," she said, "I'm Monica Dawson from Child Protective Services. We got your call about a child in need of assistance." Tom stood to greet her, then turned to Immani. "Immani, this is Miss Dawson. She's here to help us figure out what to do next. Is it okay if she asks you some questions?" Immani nodded hesitantly, her eyes darting between Tom and Miss Dawson as the latter sat down and began to speak with Immani. Tom observed closely. He could see Immani's initial reluctance, the way she gave short, quiet answers at first. But as the conversation progressed, she began to open up more, especially when Miss Dawson asked about her life before coming to America. Tom's heart swelled with mixed emotions as he listened to Immani talk about her mother, their dreams of a better life, and the pain of her loss. As the interview progressed, Tom became increasingly invested in Immani's future. He couldn't bear the thought of her being lost in a system where she might fall through the cracks again. She needed stability, care, and love, things that had been taken from her far too soon. Then, as Miss Dawson was explaining the next steps to Immani, Tom had a sudden realization. It struck him with clarity and urgency. He knew what he had to do. "Ms. Dawson," he interrupted politely, "before we go any further, there's something I'd like to discuss with you in private, if possible." Miss Dawson looked surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Sheriff. Immani, will you be okay here for a few minutes?" "We'll be right outside." Immani nodded, watching curiously as Tom and Miss Dawson stepped out of the office. Once in the hallway, Tom took a deep breath. What he was about to propose was monumental, life-changing even, but he felt it was the right path. "Miss Dawson," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach, "I'd like to apply to become Immani's foster parent, with the intention to adopt, if possible." Ms. Dawson's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Sheriff Hollis, that's a big decision. Are you sure about this?" Tom nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I know it might seem sudden, but I can't explain it. I just know that I'm meant to help this little girl, to give her a home." Ms. Dawson studied him for a moment, then a small smile appeared on her face. "Well, it's not a typical situation, but I can see how much you care for Immani. If you're serious about this, we can start the process right away. It won't be easy, and there will be a lot of paperwork and home visits. But I'll do whatever it takes," Tom interjected, his voice resolute with determination. "Immani deserves a real childhood, a family. I want to give that to her." Miss Dawson nodded in agreement. "All right then, Sheriff, let's discuss this with Immani, shall we?" As they re-entered the office, Tom felt a surge of nervousness mixed with excitement. He looked at Immani, this brave little girl who had endured so much, and felt in his heart that he was making the right decision. "Immani," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair, "how would you feel about coming to live with me? Not just for a little while, but maybe for good." Immani's eyes widened, a look of disbelief crossing her face. "Really?" she whispered. "You want me?" Tom felt tears beginning to well up in his eyes. "Yes, Immani, I want you to be part of my family, if that's okay with you." For a moment, Immani just stared at him. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile Tom had seen from her. In that moment, he knew that both their lives were about to change forever. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Tom committed himself to the process of becoming Immani's legal guardian with more determination than he had felt in years. There were forms to fill out, background checks to pass, and home visits to prepare for, but Tom never faltered in his dedication. Thanks to his role as sheriff and the urgency of Immani's situation, he was granted temporary custody while the formal processes were underway. Adjusting to their new life together was challenging for both, but Tom could see Immani slowly starting to trust him more, beginning to believe that this new life might actually be real. During one of the required home visits, Tom and Immani met with her assigned social worker, a kindly-faced woman named Sarah Thompson. As they sat in the living room of what was now Immani's home, Tom noticed the fatigue in Immani's eyes as Sarah engaged her in conversation. "Immani," Sarah said gently, "can you tell me a bit about how things have been going for you lately?" Immani glanced at Tom, seeking reassurance. He nodded encouragingly, and she took a deep breath. "It's different now," Immani said quietly, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Good different, but sometimes it's hard to talk about before." Tom felt a warmth spreading through his chest at her words. He longed to protect her from any further pain, but he knew she needed to express her feelings to heal. "You're doing great, Immani," he said softly. "I'm right here with you." Sarah smiled at Immani gently. "Can you tell me how things have changed since you started living with Sheriff Tom?" Immani's face brightened slightly. "I'm not scared all the time anymore," she said, "and I have a real bed now. Sheriff Tom even got me my own blanket with butterflies on it." Tom felt a lump form in his throat at the simple joy Immani expressed over such a basic comfort. "That sounds lovely," Sarah responded warmly. "What else do you like about staying with Sheriff Tom?" Immani thought for a moment. "He makes me pancakes on Saturdays," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "And he reads me stories before bed, even when he's tired from work." Tom hadn't realized how much these small gestures meant to Immani. He made a mental note to continue their Saturday pancake tradition. "It sounds like you and Sheriff Tom have developed a nice routine," Sarah observed. "How does that make you feel?" Immani's brow furrowed as she considered the question. "Safe," she said finally, "and happy. I didn't think I could be happy again after." She trailed off, her eyes growing distant. "It's okay," Tom said gently, reaching out to pat her hand. "You don't have to talk about anything you're not ready for." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's right, Immani. We can focus on the present and the future. Speaking of which, what are you looking forward to most about possibly living with Sheriff Tom permanently?" Immani's eyes lit up. "We're going to paint my room," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Sheriff Tom said I can pick any color I want. I think I want yellow, like sunshine." As Immani continued to chat with Sarah about her hopes for the future, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Seeing Immani come out of her shell, hearing her talk about a future filled with hope and simple joys, was more than he could have ever hoped for when he first found her in that laundromat. "Immani," Sarah said as their session was winding down, "you've been incredibly brave. But you know you don't have to face things alone anymore, right? Sheriff Hollis here wants to give you a permanent home, a family." At this, Immani looked up at Tom, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Really?" she asked, her voice small but filled with longing. "You really want me to stay forever?" Tom felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes as he moved to kneel in front of Immani, taking her small hands in his. "Yes, Immani," he said firmly. "I want you to be part of my family. I know I can never replace your mom, and I would never try to, but I want to help you build a new life. But I promise to love, protect, and provide you with the home and life you deserve," Tom declared, his voice imbued with resolve. For a moment, Immani simply stared at him, her dark eyes scanning his face for any hint of insincerity. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, "I'd like that." Tom's heart swelled with joy. He glanced up at Sarah, who was observing the scene with a smile. "So, what's next?" he asked, his voice tinged with determination. "What do we need to do to make this official?" Sarah's smile broadened. "Well, Sheriff," she replied, "we've still got some paperwork to finalize and a few more home visits to conduct. But from what I've seen today, I think we're on the right path. Immani needs stability, love, and understanding, all things you're clearly capable of providing." As they continued discussing the next steps, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He looked at Immani, this brave little girl who had already endured so much, and was certain he would do everything within his power to provide her with the life she deserved. It wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be challenges and hurdles to overcome. But seeing the hope beginning to blossom in Immani's face, Tom knew it would all be worth it. This was the start of a new chapter for both of them, a chance to heal, to grow, and to build a family together. Tom was ready to embrace every moment of it. The months that followed were filled with both challenges and triumphs. Tom dedicated himself to the process of becoming Immani's legal guardian with an unwavering determination. There were mountains of paperwork to tackle, interviews to conduct, and home visits to prepare for, but Tom never faltered in his commitment. Immani, for her part, began to slowly open up as she settled into life with Tom. Her reserved demeanor gradually gave way to show glimpses of a curious, intelligent child. Though there were difficult moments, nightmares that startled her awake, moments of fear or uncertainty that made her withdraw, each day brought visible signs of a growing trust and belief in her new life's reality. One sunny afternoon, as they sat on the porch of what was now their house, Immani looked up at Tom with serious eyes. Sheriff Tom, she still sometimes called him that, a holdover from their early days together. "Are you sure you want to keep me forever?" Tom's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. He knelt before her, looking her straight in the eye. "Immani," he said with unwavering conviction, "I've never been more sure of anything. You are my family now, and that's forever, no matter what." Immani's eyes welled up with tears, but they were tears of joy this time. She threw her arms around Tom's neck, hugging him tightly. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, the word Dad still new and precious on her lips. Tom hugged her back, his own eyes misty. "I love you too, sweetheart. So much." The day of the adoption hearing finally arrived. Tom stood in the courthouse, holding Immani's hand tightly as the judge reviewed their case. Holding his breath, he awaited the moment that would officially make them a family. Having reviewed all the evidence and testimonies, the judge began, a smile touching her lips. "I am pleased to approve this adoption. Congratulations, Sheriff Hollis and Immani. You are now, in the eyes of the law, father and daughter." The courtroom erupted in applause as Tom swept Immani into a huge hug, both laughing and crying at the same time. It was done. They were a family. As they left the courthouse, stepping out into the bright sunshine, Tom looked down at Immani, his daughter, smiling up at him with eyes bright with happiness and hope for the future. "So, Immani Hollis," he said, his heart full of love, "what should we do to celebrate?" Immani thought for a moment, then grinned. "Can we go to the laundromat?" she asked. Tom raised an eyebrow, surprised. "The laundromat? Are you sure?" Immani nodded. "It's where you found me," she said softly, "where our family started. I want to remember it, but this time as a happy place." Tom felt tears prickling his eyes once again. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Hand in hand, they walked towards the laundromat, ready to create new memories to replace the old. The laundromat looked different in the daylight, Tom thought as they stepped inside. The harsh fluorescent lights were softened by the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the hum of the machines seemed cheerful rather than lonely. Immani led him to the bench where he had found her sleeping months ago. They sat down together, and for a moment they were both quiet, lost in their memories. "You know," Tom said softly, I used to think this place was just a reminder of sad times. But now, I think it's a symbol of hope. It's where our story began. Immani nodded, leaning against him. It was really scary before, she admitted. But now, it's kind of special because I met you here. Tom wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. As they sat there, he marveled at how far they'd come. The quiet, frightened girl he discovered in this very spot was now his daughter, still quiet at times but growing more confident and happy with each passing day. Over the next few weeks, Tom noticed a change in himself as well. The weight of grief that had been his constant companion for so long began to lift. He found himself smiling more, laughing at Immani's jokes, and looking forward to each new day. One sunny morning, as Immani was getting ready for school, Tom made a decision. It was time to face something he'd been avoiding for years. "Immani," he said over breakfast, "how would you feel about visiting the cemetery with me this weekend? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Immani looked at him curiously. "Who?" Tom took a deep breath. "My first daughter, Emily, and my wife, Sarah. I think it's time I introduced you to them." Immani's eyes widened, but she nodded solemnly. "Okay," she said softly. "Can I bring flowers?" That Saturday, they stood hand in hand before two well-tended graves. Tom felt a familiar ache in his chest, but it was tempered now by the warmth of Immani's hand in his. "Sarah, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Immani. She's our daughter now. I think you would have loved her." Immani stepped forward, placing a small bouquet of flowers on each grave. "Hi," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you, but I promise I'll take good care of Dad. We'll take care of each other." Tom felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of sorrow. As they walked back to the car, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. His past and his present had finally reconciled, and he could look to the future with hope. As time passed, they developed their own rituals and traditions. Every Saturday morning, they would go to the laundromat together. It wasn't because they needed to do laundry there anymore. Tom's house had a perfectly good washer and dryer, but it had become a special place for them, a reminder of where their journey together had begun. One such Saturday morning, as they sat on the familiar bench watching the machine spin, Immani looked up at Tom with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, the words still bringing a warmth to Tom's heart every time he heard it, "do you ever think about what if you didn't find me that night?" Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "And every day I'm grateful that I did find you. You've brought so much happiness into my life, Immani. I hope you know that." Immani smiled, snuggling closer. "You saved me," she said simply. Tom shook his head, feeling the familiar prick of tears in his eyes. "No, sweetheart, we saved each other." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the lonely nights of his past to the joy-filled days of his present, from the scared little girl in the laundromat to the amazing young woman beside him now. Life had taken them both on a difficult path, full of loss and hardship, but it had also led them to each other, to this family they had built together. And as Tom sat there, his daughter by his side and a future full of promise ahead of them, he knew that every step of that journey had been worth it. In the end, it wasn't just about a sheriff discovering why a little girl was at the laundromat every night. It was about two lonely souls finding each other, about healing and hope, and about the incredible power of love to transform lives. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of unexpected family and newfound hope. If Sheriff Tom and Immani's story touched you as deeply as it did us, I've handpicked another story I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it now.